research, so I'm going to pull up the slides. I'm going to leave questions at the end, but feel free that if you have any questions, any thoughts and concerns, to leave them in the chat. And as I go through, if I see them in the chat, I'll kind of pop in. For now, if you have any issues hearing or seeing my screen, just do like, you can just unmute your mic and let me know. I'm going to give it a couple seconds before I proceed. In the meantime, I believe this is being recorded. Perfect. Okay, so this is a huge portion of my dissertation research. So language and belonging, affirming Asian Canadian identities in Mandarin bilingual programs. Nancy, was at my mock oral defense, would have seen a portion of this. This is kind of a larger version of what I had for that talk, just because there's more time and space. An overview of what I'll go through today, I'll talk about the program, I'll go through my research questions and context, into detail about methodology, because I know some of you in this room would actually be interested in some of the methodological data collection analysis parts, go through my participants, discuss the lengthy findings, a bit of my conclusion, and then a Q&A at the end. So I'm just going to start with what the Mandarin Bilingual Program is. I know that most people here that you're from Ontario. So the Mandarin Bilingual Program was actually launched in the 1970s to promote Mandarin language education and support multiculturalism and multilingualism in Alberta. And when this happened, it was actually through protesting and solidarity among Ukrainian and Cantonese speaking and Mandarin speaking Chinese parents in Alberta. And what these parents did was that they band together and they said that heritage language are protected minority languages. They fought minority language rights, which traditionally in Canada, minority language means that if you're in a francophone speaking province, English is the minority language. If you're in an anglophone speaking province, French is the minority language. And they actually banded together and said, no, minority languages should be heritage languages that other people speak when they immigrate to Canada. Your two bilingual languages as a bilingual country, those are the majority language. So they actually fought against that, and together they were able to push for these bilingual programs, which is similar to French immersion, but instead of being taught in French, you are taught half the day a dual track model where half your courses are taught in English and the other half in your heritage language. I'm going to speak to specifically the Mandarin bilingual program, but off the top of my head, they have German, Spanish, Arabic, Japanese, Korean. Like they have varying models and versions of languages offered within these bilingual programs. And I think that's something very special that other provinces do not have. And it's essentially your classes are taught, you're not taking Mandarin courses, you're not taking Spanish courses, you're not taking German courses. You are taking half your courses in that target language. And that is something that only exists in its current form in Alberta. BC and Manitoba are also trying to develop this as well. And Ontario, there's been a new push towards this as well. But with Ontario, very challenging because a lot of our protections and policies is for the Catholic School Board. So this is the policy and advocacy surrounding this program, and that the only reason bilingual programs exist is because of immigrant parents who wanted their children to succeed and to have their own heritage language, and that they didn't look at whether Ukrainian and Chinese languages were the same. They didn't care about any of that. They saw each other as people and they joined hands to protest. And they won very spectacularly. Alberta has the largest school choice for languages in across Canada. So it is within this backdrop that I conducted my study. And my research questions might look a little bit interesting to you because I actually looked at how the intersectionality of someone's ethnicity, nationality, and culture impacted their schooling experiences within these Mandarin bilingual programs. I looked at how they navigated things like the model minority myth, which I'll go over, Sinophobia, and anti-Asian racism. I also looked at how students describe their classroom experiences within the teaching practice related to cultural responsiveness and whether students perceive these programs validating their culture, language, and identity. And I think something very special is that I completely went into this looking at the historical context of anti-Asian racism in Canada. When I started my PhD, it was still during the pandemic with lockdowns. And I think everybody remembers that during the pandemic, things were kind of scary. There was a lot of terrible things happening within the Asian population of stereotypes and racism. And it is with this backdrop that I was like, I want to look more into the history. And while Alberta's education system did teach me about the Chinese head tax, which imposed and discouraged Chinese immigration, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned Chinese immigration from 1923 to 1947, the internment of Japanese Canadians during World War II, all of this was rooted in Sinophobia, which is a persistent fear and prejudice against people of Chinese descent. And these policies were aimed to marginalize and limit opportunities for Asian Canadians. Um, what the COVID pandemic did, though, was that there was a resurgence. So, my research actually began as a response to the surge in hate crimes, particularly the harmful media rhetoric of like the Chinese virus, the Kung flu. There was a psychological toll and hypervigilance among Chinese communities. And actually, a lot of research during that time showed that people of other Asian backgrounds who were Southeast Asian and East Asian would try to say, I'm not Chinese when they're in public. They actually urge their children to not speak their heritage languages, urge their children to demonstrate that they're not Chinese for the fear of their own safety. So this is what they created was this lack of solidarity, but this lack of solidarity not because of a lack of empathy, but because of a fear of your own safety. So I think there was a lot of articles back then shaming people who were like, I'm not Chinese, or shaming people for saying don't speak Mandarin or Cantonese in public. But I think what people forget is that your fear and hypervigilance and your safety comes first. And for me, I think that response signals a societal issue with safety concerns, not individual responses in protecting themselves and their children. So then I wanted to understand how Chinese Canadian youth navigate their identity, language, and belonging during this rising xenophobia. Something else in terms of while conducting my literature review is I found that xenophobia actually showed up in the classroom in multiple ways. There is a rise in racially motivated bullying during the pandemic. Chinese students reported feeling unsafe at school. There's actually higher rates of remote learning among Asian students in North America, and they cited anti-Asian racism as a reason for opting out of in-person classes. So rather than putting their mask on and going to school where they were going to be bullied, oftentimes Asian students opted for online learning for their own safety. And this really demonstrates how racism disrupts educational access and safety, especially for racialized students during times of crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic is just one of many of racialized pandemics and like racialized aspects of how we treat disease and viruses that like when Ebola was happening, many things happening that rather than targeting the systemic societal health issues, we chose scapegoats and targeted people. So this actually demonstrated how this manifests into the classroom. There was also layers of harm. So stereotypes preceding COVID-19 is the model minority myth, with stereotypes Chinese among other Asian students as high achieving and self-sufficient. This is also very common among South Asian students and Jewish populations that they are high achieving, that they don't struggle, that they are able to assimilate and conform to Canadian culture. And what this creates, though, is a disconnect with their heritage, language, and cultural background. So this existing harm predates the COVID-19 pandemic. And while this seems positive, what this actually meant is that now that students are experiencing racism, they don't know how to get help because of the perception that they're high achieving and don't struggle. They avoid help seeking because help seeking makes you seem less than what is the model minority. And in the classroom, this means that students are picked on for being nerds and labeled as perpetual foreigners and outsiders. And as a result, research on both Chinese immigrant and Chinese-born Canadian experiences among other Asian youth is that they don't feel a connection to their parents' home countries. They don't speak their language, but they also feel disconnected with Canadian culture and identity. So there's a lot of disconnect happening for hyphenated identities. And I think everyone here who knowing some of your research, I'm sure you've seen this happen within your own realm with language and belonging as well. And what this brought me to is the role of schools in combating anti-Asian racism. So I started looking at policy. Schools are daily social environments. They're key sites where identity, belonging, and peer relationships are shaped. Educational responsibility as an institution where children have to be there. In Ontario, Alberta, other provinces, students are is mandatory to attend school until ninth grade, in some 10th grade and other sixth grades. If they have to be there, we have a moral and institutional responsibility to protect their safety and well-being. I also see schools as opportunities for intervention and change. These are some of the most kind people choosing to be educators, the most wonderful people choosing to do this type of research. This is where we have opportunities for culturally responsive practices to disrupt harmful narratives and to support students in ways that are just beyond language, learning, academic achievement. It is about social emotional well-being. It is about who they are as people. It is about who they are as individuals and about their safety when they're going to class and making friends and seeing their teachers as role models. So, within this backdrop, the study itself is a qualitative inquiry informed by critical ethnography on student experiences in the Alberta Mandarin bilingual program. While there was no extended fieldwork, it was grounded in the participants' lived experiences, the broader socio-political context, as well as the structural conditions that shape identity. And I think like the entire introduction spiel I've provided, now you're seeing that while I didn't do a single site, Alberta's Mandarin program in and of itself is actually an atypical case when it comes to case studies, in a sense that within Canada, these programs only exist in one province, and that the program itself, across different school sites, across different things, their curricular content, the way they train their teachers, it is seen as an ethnographic study of how these students navigate their school sites, how they develop culture, and how that differs from regular public programs. Within my data collection, I actually conducted 17 one-on-one semi-structured interviews. For all my critical qualitative scholars, you know that 17 one-on-one semi-structured interviews, they're 60 to 90 minutes each. I transcribed them and coded them, and these were very long. But within this interview, my selection criteria was Chinese Canadians over the age of 18, graduated high school from 2018 to 2023, and was enrolled for a minimum of 6 years in Alberta's Mandarin bilingual program. I just wanted to catch that COVID-19 experience. But if for people who've done ethics, you know, interviewing 18 and above is what OISE prefers. So I was like, okay, I'm not going to go into the schools, but I will interview students as young as possible within that above 18 realm to capture the most recent experiences. On the screen is a table of my participants. You'll see their pseudonyms. They were actually chosen to reflect their cultural, ethnic, and linguistic identities. You'll see that they speak many languages. They speak Cantonese, Hakka, Malay, Teochew, in addition to English and Mandarin at home. Some participants identified as Han Chinese, while others were of a minority Chinese background and others were multiracial. And I really want to highlight that what we say Chinese in the English language and in Canada, we mean Han Chinese. When you ask people from China what they are, they often say, I'm Han, I'm Hakka, they have all these different ethnic backgrounds, and that some students within the program were very aware of their ethnic backgrounds, others not so much, depending on if they're second generation, third generation. A lot of the ethnic minority backgrounds kind of get watered down the more generations behind that was. So that's why you'll see some students had modifiers and some didn't. That's highly dependent on how they identify. But honestly, if you're looking at the ethnicity of my participants, even within the bilingual program, we're seeing it reflect the rising diversity in Canadian classrooms. This is not just mainland Han Chinese students. This is a huge diversity of East, Southeast, and multiracial participants. In terms of my data analysis, I actually conducted 2 rounds of coding on in vivo. In vivo coding first and descriptive codes second. And then I did a thematic analysis using tenets from critical race theory in education and Asian critical theory with a specific focus on counter storytelling. And for people who are interested in counter storytelling in any critical work, it centers your participants' lived experiences as a form of resistance against dominant narratives. So what they were telling me were their stories, their lived experiences were actually lived resistance against the mono-minority myth, Sinophobia, and anti-Asian racism. While this is not a theoretical lecture, I do believe that if you are interested in critical work, to really understand the tenets and the theories behind your themes, so that when you analyze your data, you are looking at it from a higher, broader realm of what is this theory trying to say? What are these counter stories? And then coding your work so that you really understand what your participant stories, what they're telling you. Research is not just isolated quotations. Together, thematically, they tell a story. And the story I'm telling today includes this intersectionality piece where race, gender, and multiracial identities really shape linguistic hierarchies, which privileges standard Mandarin, and that ethnic backgrounds like Hakka, Cantonese, Southeast Asian Chinese were often seen as less than, and that this idea of authentically, who is authentically Chinese, is actually negotiated within my work that I never expected would come up, and that gender also played a role how participants navigated their identities. So, in terms of my major findings now, I'm going to share six. I know that sounds like a lot. I'm going to try to get through six and I'm going to look at time. And the major findings is disrupting xenophobia and sense of belonging, the impact of culturally responsive curriculum, language and identity, and how students define their Asian Canadian identity, how the model minority myth is manifested and disrupted, COVID-19, so is xenophobia and peer solidarity, and finally, a safer space for who. So I'm going to start. The first are some good things. How does the Mandarin bilingual program disrupt xenophobia within their schools by creating a strong community? And I'm actually going to start this theme with a quotation from Liu Siqing Huang, who spent her entire interview raving about how positive her experience was in the program. This is a student who was in the program for 9 years. She is Chinese descent, speaks Mandarin at home. She shared, I think that's a really valuable part of the system. Just growing up from both sides, you know? As a kid, you want to have your identity, but at the same time, you don't live in China. With the program, though, we're not being assimilated. I don't want to share that at the time of the interview, I believe she was 19, and she felt so proud of being Chinese Canadian because she never felt like she had to assimilate into Canadian culture, into learning English, into giving up Chinese while in the program. And that this is actually something that is shown across my interviews. My findings suggest that the integration of Chinese language and culture in these Mandarin bilingual classrooms really fostered a strong sense of belonging within the schools and their communities. These students felt a deep connection to their heritage, and they don't feel the pressure to assimilate. And their Asian identity and Mandarin capabilities were actually a source of pride, making their ethnicity a positive aspect of their K to 12 education experience. And this actually is very different to other public schools where oftentimes students of any hyphenated identity, either they're Latina, they're, South Asian, they're East Asian, oftentimes that ethnicity and culture can be a hindrance to belonging within Canadian schools. And that these schools actually really normalized being Asian. And Dan Huynh, who was Vietnamese Chinese, really specifically stated multiple times in our interview that I guess it's not just being singled out. And he found that when other students were in regular schools, they're singled out. You're the only Asian kid. Your lunch smells. People make fun of you. You speak another language. Your clothes is different. Your hair is a different texture. And he felt that it's completely different for him because he grew up in a class with all Asian kids, learning the language and everything. And he said Dan Hyun is Vietnamese. So like even though he wasn't Han Chinese, he felt seen and he felt like he belonged within the Mandarin bilingual program from the visual aspect that his teachers looked like him, his classmates looked like him, and he didn't stand out. He wasn't singled out. And truly, this was an impact of the culturally responsive curriculum within the Alberta program. So something that people don't realize that the Mandarin bilingual program's curricular content is exactly the same as all public schools. So the kids are learning the same curricular content. They just rewrote the exact curriculum in Mandarin. So everything they're learning is normalized, is not treated as extra, is not an add-on, is not a tack-on, is not exotic. And within the culturalized aspect is that what they added was like Chinese language and culture. They added and there was also German language and culture, Spanish language and culture for each language program. What they added was celebrations. So students didn't see Canadian holidays or Western holidays as different from Chinese holidays. They actually saw them as the same thing. It was integrated and taught in a way where students couldn't even tell. Like if you asked some of the bilingual students when they were 6 if the Spring Festival was a Chinese or Western holiday, they're like, I don't know, it's just a holiday. You ask them what Halloween was, you ask them all these things. Everything was normalized as just traditions and holidays rather than exotic or peripheral to school life. And this normalization played a huge part in boosting students' confidence and cultural identities. And it actually made them want to speak Mandarin and learn their Chinese dialects and English even more. And this one student, Yan Wang, was so funny. During our interview at the time, she was 21. She is Hong Kong Chinese, speaks Cantonese at home. And when I asked her, I'm like, what are your favorite like Asian holidays? She went on a tangent. She's like, well, we had Christmas concerts and then we had Chinese New Year's and we had like Lantern Festival and Halloween events and we had Valentine's. It was all just really normal to me. She didn't differentiate Chinese holidays and Western holidays. And it was actually during her interview that I stopped asking people what their favorite Asian holiday was. I'm like, what's your favorite holiday? Because I was trying to get at whether these kids celebrated Chinese holidays, whether they understood this part of their culture. And it was very clear and very obvious after 3 interviews, she was my third participant. Oh, they knew. And actually, it's very normalized. It wasn't an addition or a tack on, it was a part of their everyday life. And I think that's very special and something that a lot of Asian students in other parts of Canada don't get. They get a cultural day and maybe a Lunar New Year tack on, but they don't get it embedded. They don't get to make lanterns and then celebrate Halloween and then make Valentine's Day's cards and then talk about, moon cakes. All of that is embedded within the classroom. And something about that was very special in a sense that the culture added to language and identity. And I think this is the part that a lot of people think my study would have been on specifically was, well, how do they use their language? How fluent are they? I think that's actually secondary. For many of the students, learning Mandarin was just a part of their everyday life, and it actually didn't replace their home languages. So if you remember my participants, they spoke Cantonese, Malay, Teochew, all these other languages, and that because they could speak Mandarin and English in their classrooms, they actually made them feel safe to then speak their own dialects, to embrace their hyphenated identity of something normal and empowering rather than conflicting. So the next participant, Ying Yue Lin, I interviewed her, oh wow, like February 2023. And she was very adamant. I'm like, do you want to choose your pseudonym? She's like, I don't want to choose my pseudonym. You can choose one for me. But when you choose my pseudonym, it has to be a Chinglish name. And I was like, what do you mean a Chinglish name? She's like, I don't want like Betty Lynn or like, something that she didn't want an English name. She wanted an anglicized version of a Chinese name. And how she describes is that even her name in of itself is very Asian Canadian. And that when she speaks Chinglish, it's very Asian Canadian. She's going to have to use English letters to write her name because documents here can't screen for Chinese characters, but she didn't want to give herself an English name either because her identity is Asian Canadian. She has a cultural name that is impactful and meaningful to her, and it's okay that it is anglicized. She didn't want so that was the one thing. She's like, I don't know what my pseudonym's gonna be, but can you please make it a part of my identity? I want people to very clearly see my name and know who I am. And I think that was very powerful and at this time she was 20, that a 20-year-old said this, that's all I ask of you. And that what she spoke about, this sense of pride and sense of self, really contrasted their peers who didn't go to bilingual programs because these students are university now. When they went to university, they're like their peers were discouraged from using their heritage languages. And they felt that they were able to encourage and maintain many home languages. They could redefine what it means to be Asian Canadian, and that in embracing their identity, um, they felt bad for some of their peers. They actually felt really bad in university talking to some of their peers who couldn't speak Cantonese at home, who were not encouraged to speak Mandarin, who had English first homes, or who went to schools that bullied them. They felt like that it was such a harm that other young Asian Canadians, other hyphenated Canadians, couldn't embrace their identities the way they did. And Christine Zhao, who is this sentiment was actually beautifully captured by Christine Zhao, who was 21 at the time of the interview, and she said, Asian Canadians, we're just one of many hyphenated identities here in Canada. So I think that's what it means to be Canadian. Just accepting that there are multiple parts to yourself, and that's fine. I am both Asian and Canadian. And something she said, I am 100% both. Ethnicity and nationalities are different things. Don't tell me I am less than just because I look different from you. And that is something that came up often in her interviews that she wanted people to accept themselves, but she also recognized that her acceptance came from the privilege of attending a bilingual program that celebrated her identity, whereas a lot of her peers in university at the U of A or UBC and U of T, they didn't grow up with the same type of encouragement. So that is something that is very important that I want people to get is that these culturally responsive programs, the fact that your teachers look like you, the fact that your language is encouraged was a huge confident booster for a lot of these students. Now I'm going to shift the tone a little bit in terms of the model minority myth and manifestations. So the model minority myth itself, I'm sure most of you know, is that this perception that Asian people get good grades, are hardworking, they have no problems, and they're very wealthy. Something unfortunate was that within the program, students did feel this pressure. Jackson is Hong Kong Chinese. He was 21 at the time of the interview, and he was actually going to university to become a teacher educator. And he said that he felt so much pressure to do well in school. He felt like all his friends were getting A's, and that if he didn't, he was dumb or a bad Asian. And this perpetuation of the model minority myth is actually something the Mandarin bilingual program did. The Mandarin bilingual schools actually fostered this social culture where academic success was heavily influenced. Like students bonded over shared academic goals. There's this pressure to conform to high standards. People sought social validation through their achievements. And unlike other Chinese Canadian students, though, who were bullied, like they're too smart, they're such a nerd, what a loser, instead of being bullied for being the model minority, within the Mandarin bilingual program, it was a social currency. Having good grades, doing well, it was a social currency that your peers saw within this hierarchy. Talia Chan, second generation Chinese Canadian student, mentioned that she talked about her grades all the time with her friends. They're always talking about their grades. She would get nervous after a test. Did you get this question? What did you get? And she's like it was in a group. And that while it fosters strong friendships, it was also like this toxicity of the importance of grades just being pinged off of student to teacher to student to family members. And that it was something the Mandarin bilingual program inadvertently fostered because a lot of their program brochures that I was reading during my research was like students who speak a second language have higher academic performance. Students who speak a second language have higher like neural like development. So they were really pushing that to encourage people to learn a second language, which inadvertently pushed this model minority myth. However, while the minority myth was perpetuated, because of the previous sections, I talked about how it fostered cultural and linguistic pride. It also meant that it created a lot of social justice students who were then subverting the model minority myth. So Carl Jung is one of my, you're not supposed to have favorites, but he is one of my favorite participants because his life motto is it's okay to be average. And I told him I will quote him in every single lecture I ever do because he stated, I don't really like being called smart. I want to be average. I want to be an average person. I want the average life. I want to die average. You know what I mean? Average, it's okay. It's okay to be average. And kind of carrying off of that, Alina Zhang was my youngest participant. She turned 18 the day before the interview because she really wanted to do the interview. And she said, I am more than my race. I am not your model minority. And I think what the program does, because they foster this sense of identity and they foster this sense of confidence, they also created these students who are advocates of their individuality, of who they are, of challenging the mono minority myth. These were very young participants at 18 and 21 who stood up to racial stereotypes. And like even me as a 31-year-old woman now, I did the thing. I did the peak Asian thing. I did my PhD in 4 years. I went and taught. Um, am I challenging this narrative of being a mono minority? I don't know. But my participants are. They are reclaiming the stereotype they're subverting. And I think this actually shows the nuance and complexity of how racialization within the Mandarin bilingual program is while it fosters some of that model minorityness, in having the confidence and language part, it's also creating a group of students who are pushing against stereotypes in ways that you don't see in a lot of teenagers. And what this brings me back is actually full circle. So my work started as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and I found all that other stuff. Well, what else did I find? I did find COVID-19 things, and unfortunately, my participants also said that the COVID-19 pandemic made them feel vulnerable and they saw hate online. Some of them faced racist jokes at university and at school. Some of them actually endured racist remarks. But something that's very important is that while the pandemic was terrible, John said that people would be like, stop eating bats, or like, this is because of you because they grew up within the Mandarin bilingual program, Leo, Yan, and Alyssa, who are female participants, were like, I just turned my social media off. I just ignored it because these people don't matter to me. And Leo specifically said it's actually embarrassing that these grown men are bullying teenage girls. And the confidence that they had to say that, I was amazed. Jackson and John at the time were in university, and they said John specifically, someone told him stop eating bats, and he was like, I'm gonna eat bat for lunch tomorrow. So then, like, they responded to these racialized jokes with confidence because they said that, like, within the program, they have peers. They know who they are. They're confident and they can confront their bullies head on. The most unfortunate counter narrative I have was Talia, who actually didn't know what to say. During a Lunar New Year event during COVID-19, her peers, to help celebrate, were like, okay, why don't we broadcast an online lion dance show to make people feel better during the pandemic? And this is a group of Mandarin bilingual students who did it for multiple public schools in Edmonton. This was to support their peers, and there were comments like Kung Flu, get out of our country. And she didn't know what to do. She froze. And she said that she was very upset with herself because all her peers were fighting back and joking, and she was upset. And that she had to find healing later on in a sense where like I needed to find out why I was so upset by people who don't matter to me. So I think this is very important in the sense that there was a gender difference in the narratives and that no matter how confident you are, racism still hurts. And across these narratives though is this idea of peer solidarity. So the Mandarin bilingual program fostered belonging and peer solidarity where students had the space to process, resist, and recover from racism. And that these possibilities existed alongside structural harm, not outside it. The fact that these public forums within the school, like people were still being racist, means that structured harm exists, but that these possibilities can also exist. So I think that's something very important to understand that holding this tension, that there's contradiction, the schools aren't perfect, the teachers aren't perfect. People are still saying racist things. When you leave K to 12 education to university, now it's freedom, free for all. Your peers are going to say whatever they want to say, but that some of that protection that they had from friendships and peer solidarity carries on into their university and then adult lives. One of my participants messaged me. He started his first practicum as a teacher, and he's like, I'm going to be the most culturally responsive teacher. He teaches in a public school rather than the bilingual program, but a lot of that he has now taken with him as a teacher outside the program. So I think that is something very fascinating to see. I didn't do a longitudinal study. I just kept in contact with my participants and they're just kind of updating me about their lives. Um, and then this final piece. So I talked a lot about the good things, some of the bad. This final piece is something I found, and I originally wasn't going to put it in my dissertation because I was urged not to, but I put it in anyways. So I'm going to slow down here and complicate this idea that the Mandarin bilingual program does provide meaningful space. It is wonderful, but that doesn't mean it didn't actually cause harm. Tian Min was a Vietnamese and white student and multiracial. And she said one of her friends, who was also multiracial, dropped out at a very young age because of racism. And I know that reverse racism does not exist as a theoretical term. However, my participants specifically said that reverse racism in the program happened, that white students who were multiracial and physically more white appearing than their peers were bullied. And that for Tian Min, every day she's just like, I wish I was fully Asian. Like, why am I half white? I want to be fully Asian. And these experiences show how cultural gatekeeping can occur even in spaces where diversity is meant to be celebrated. And that exclusion doesn't come just within public programs. Exclusion also happens within these culturally affirming programs. Carl Zhang as well is an ethnic minority. He's Hakka Chinese. And he said one of my biggest gripes about the Mandarin program was that they push this idea that everyone should be Han Chinese assimilated. What about Hakka? What about ethnic minorities? What about multiracial students? Carl Jang actually went on to do a major in East Asian studies, and he really pushes how this one China Han Chinese identity is being pushed on to erase and eradicate ethnic minorities, and he thinks that's wrong. He actually said he was scared to say it because he wasn't sure what I was trying to look for. He's like, but your last name is PHAM, so I'm assuming you're Vietnamese are also a minority, so you'll understand where I'm coming from. But the fact that he was scared to voice this really shows that there are tensions, right? We have racialized hierarchies external to the program. We have ethnic hierarchies within the program. So this begs us to question a safer space for who? This is a very supportive program. I've demonstrated that with my findings. However, multiracial and ethnic minority students still remain underserved. And while both programs really appreciated both students really appreciated the program and their efforts, they felt like it was important to voice their struggle. Because they're like, the goal is not perfection, the goal is improvements. And while the program is a wonderful comparison to the public program, that doesn't mean that they can't continue to improve. And I think that's where the implications are. Rethinking culture. I think minority heritage language in Canada, for many ethnic groups in China, so like Mandarin is a minority language in Canada, but for many ethnic groups in China, Mandarin is an imperialist language that conquered them, right? So there are tensions and contradictions that people don't understand. Are a lot of our policymakers who dictate Chinese as a minority language come from westernized notions of language. For a lot of Southeast and East Asians, it is an imperialist language, right? And that this diversity of Cantonese, Hakka, English, Malay, Mandarin, Teochew, and so on and so forth, challenges this notion of a singular Chinese identity. And I think it's very important that if this program and if these programs want to continue to exist, they need to recognize that promoting a singular Han Chinese identity is enacting harm within the diversity that the program has. The same way public schools push English essentialism is enacting harm upon heritage languages. So I think that's something that's very important. And within these implications is that being Chinese alone doesn't mean that teachers and administrators all practice culture responsive pedagogy. Students like Tian, who are like multiracial, and Carl, who is ethnic minority, had a lot of gripes and issues with their teachers. And what this key takeaway is that language as cultural identity and support is that bilingual education definitely supports students' cultural identity, definitely supports a sense of belonging, and that students use language to navigate who they are. But there's also program and policy implications, right? So, like, while the program is imperfect, Alberta's Mandarin bilingual program actually serves as a model for heritage language across Canada. And I think it actually proves that policymakers should invest and expand on heritage language programming to support identity development, to support cultural preservation, and that schools should recognize the value of bilingualism not just for academic success, but for social, emotional well-being and intercultural competence. And what these collective stories really point to you and to me, and I hope for everyone, is the importance of heritage language retention, the importance of culturally responsive teaching, and the significance of representation for visual minority students in Canadian classrooms. And while it might appear that my focus was on Chinese Canadian student experience, that my research might also offer the same reductive outlook on racial identities, I would like to clarify that my work does not speak for all Mandarin bilingual students, nor does it speak for Chinese Canadians at large. What my research offers us, though, is a glimpse. It is a glimpse into the lived experiences of Chinese Canadian students and asserts that we are not a monolith. We are more than math whizzes. And in the wise words of Elena and Carl, we are not your model minority. And that brings us to if you have any questions, thoughts, and concerns. I'll go into the chat. So Nancy says, since this program started in 1970s,